Katy sat there alone, feeling broken. The wind gently blew the leaves around like nature's own litter. The collection of man's discarded achievements rattled and rustled around, the leaves like noisy cousins chasing after them in a desperate bid to avoid missing out on something interesting. Perched silently and on the bench, she watched the world and its eclectic mix of life pass by. A rose in one hand and a letter in the other. She looked over at the letter, soaking up the beauty on the page, and then scanned the park intensely, not knowing what to expect. The sense of anticipation, she placed a dethroned rose behind her left ear, hanging it through her hair to prevent it slipping out and falling. Katy watched as birds busied themselves from tree to tree and rooftop to rooftop. She watched the colours of the many beautiful flowers mix and blur as they swayed gently in the breeze. Then she saw a butterfly fluttering from one flower to another. Katy watched it intently as it landed on the metal railing at the edge between the grass and the path. She loved butterflies. She always had, ever since she was a little girl. Everything had to tie in with butterflies. Katy even had a little butterfly tattoo on the inside of her wrist, which she had gotten into the habit of stroking every night as she fell asleep, longing for her Mr. Right to come to her. Katy continued to sit there, silent and anxious. She could feel herself becoming more and more nervous with every passing minute. She could feel it in her stomach, up and up. The tension in her belly increased with each passing minute. The feeling was becoming more and more unbearable, so much so that she had to hold on to her belly with her hands in order to try and ease it, even if it was an instinctive reaction to psychologically reassure herself, which she suspected it was anyway. But it didn't seem to work. The feeling of nerves, fear, trepidation, confusion and apprehension just kept getting worse, so much so that she began to feel like she was going to be sick. She leant forward as she felt her gorge rise. She could feel it moving up her body from her stomach. Katy felt her belly go queer. The sensation moved up and out, her guts immediately beginning to settle again afterwards, providing her with some immediate relief, even for just a short while, at least from that particular sensation. But now she was greeted with the uncomfortable sensation, the sickness moving up her chest and initiating the gag reflex in her throat. Katy watched over and again. She retched and retched, but nothing came up, and she vomited nothing in return. Then, the feeling worn down, she felt a tickle, gentle and almost apologetic in its movement. Before she could do anything about it, and before she could react in any way, she felt it move up into her throat, then in her mouth. Opening her mouth, frowning with both concern and confusion, she watched as two beautiful, delicate wings fluttered out, encompassing and carrying what looked like the most fragile little body she had ever seen, out into the wide chaos of the world, beyond the nervous system of her own body. Katy watched it, stunned and mesmerised in equal measure. Colours glittering and dancing off its wings, like tiny ballet performers holding rainbows. Its small black body covered in soft hairs, like a miniature fur coat, shifting and swaying with the beat of its colourful wings. It was quite possibly the single most beautiful thing she had ever seen, more precious than a family heirloom and prettier than a priceless jewel. She watched it for a few moments. A tear, soft and sweet, slid down her cheek, reflecting the light from the sun and sparkling in full spectrum of colours as it moved, paving a pathway down her face. The butterfly of grace seemed to look back at her. Just for a few moments they were both sat, staring back at each other, neither of them moving, both seemingly reluctant to react. Then, with a movement that could almost be interpreted as a gesture, as if to say, "Follow me," which is what Katy read it as, the butterfly, almost iridescent, sparkling and glorious, took to the air and fluttered around for a moment or two before making its way down the path. Katy set off after it in pursuit. Katy couldn't explain any of this if she were to be asked, least of all to herself. She had to catch that butterfly. She had to know more to understand, to keep it, to bring it back to herself, to make it personal, to make it hers, and hers alone again. Running down the path after it, her arms outreached, and her hands waving in order to try and gently capture its delicate existence inside them. Time and again, relentless, she chased the butterfly. Without realizing it, they had left the confines of the park long behind them and were travelling fast through the city. Sirens wailed in the distance, of fires, of people being rescued, arrested, of people being saved. But none of this fazed her. All she wanted, all she could concentrate on, was catching her butterfly of nervousness. Through the city they moved, out through the suburbs, and eventually into the little explored countryside. Further and further they travelled. Farther and farther away they got from everyone and everything Katy had ever known. Until in the distance, a large house loomed into view. The butterfly seemed to sense this and settled down on an old broken tree stump, which gave her a moment to rest and catch her breath and reflect on her journey of madness, of mad impulsiveness. Next to where she had stopped herself was a gorgeous wild flower. Its petals were blue and glassy, tipped with what looked like a white glaze that sparkled like glitter. The butterfly paused as if waiting for her to catch her breath. Katy stilled herself, trying to not give away her secret intentions for this extra moment of rest, hoping to finally capture the magic butterfly made of her own flesh. Katy reached out slowly and carefully, like a big cat hunting its prey. Just as she got close enough and within striking range, the butterfly seemed to sense it and took off once again, fluttering around her like it was trying to tell her something. She spun around, following its orbit, around her, trying to listen to hear what its magical whispering message could be. Then it changed course and fluttered off again. Katy set off again, back in pursuit of it once more. It wasn't until they reached a path unlike the rest that they had been traversing, a path with a mosaic-like tiled design. She watched the butterfly descend and settle down on another wild flower that seemed to grow from between two broken tiles. Katie looked up to see where she was as the butterfly flapped its wings a few times extra as it rested there, folding its beautiful wings up together. There, although dirty and faded, she could see what looked like a wonderful painting of a butterfly, just like her butterfly, decorating a mosaic path. Stunned, she looked up even further to be greeted by a large old house, seemingly in ill repair, paint faded and cracking, wood splitting and rotting, dirt and cobwebs adorning every corner and crevice. Katie's heart began to pump and beat hard. She turned back to her wholly lonely companion and watched it. Her pounding heart began to break. But why? That she didn't know. But break it did, as the beautiful creature, born of her own being, born of herself, hers and hers alone, to own, to possess, and love, began to break up and gently shatter. It began to shatter itself and scatter like an artist's perfectly designed piece of poetry. Even in its death, it made a beauty incomparable to anything she can imagine elsewhere, of grace and perfection. Millions of sparkling particles glistened in the sunlight as they bounced and danced in the warm air as they fell back down to earth, like someone had sprinkled magic dust around. Katie looked down. The loss she felt right then and there was beyond anything she had ever experienced before, and would likely since. It was somehow more personal, more profound than she could acknowledge to herself. She had somehow lost something of herself, and with all its hopes and all her dreams had somehow gone with it. The pain was just too much, too intense now for her to even be able to perform such a basic emotional instinct as to cry. The hurt was far too acute to be wasted on something as useless as tears. But then, just as hope had died, and dreams expired along with it, so the hand of creation seemed to intervene. She began to experience something different, something remarkable. Katie began to take her head from out of her hands, where she had buried in such anguish and grief. As she did, she noticed two deep, black, polished shoes on the path of the old house. Up her head, and thus her eyes travelled. Up and up her gaze moved, and she began to register a figure standing there on the path. The shoes belonged to a man, and there, standing before her with an impeccable suit, was the most perfect, beautiful man. His achingly beautiful face, decorated with a wide, handsome smile, gentle and genuine. His sparkling eyes locked on hers. His beauty was comparable to that butterfly she had borne and had made her want to weep again. It made her want to weep over and over. Katie looked at him, studying him and his perfectness intently. As she did so, she noticed a rose sitting like a proud father of a bride in his breast pocket. She looked back at him, her eyes confused, undecided as to whether to frown or open wide. His skin began to show itself even more to her new and lasting consciousness. She could see it was not just perfect, but it was so perfect it seemed to glow, to sparkle, with a special iridescence all around it, like a glitter, but only more sublime. Katie looked down with a coyness that had become a hallmark of hers, and which had doomed her to loneliness for much of her adult life. As she looked down, she saw that she was holding a letter of some kind in his hand. She steeled herself again, and reaching out, gently took a hold of his hand. Raising it to herself, she could see that it was handwritten and decorated with the most wonderful calligraphy she had ever seen since the one she held in her own pocket. Katie didn't need to see any more. She could tell it matched her letter perfectly, and just as gently as before, she let his hand fall back down to his side once again. This time, her eyes opened wide as planets. A deep and wide smile rushed across her youthful face, and opening her arms as wide as she physically could, she threw herself at him and wrapped her arms excitedly around him. He, in return, gently and lovingly wrapped his arms around her and brought her closer into him. Katie nestled her head into his chest with a deep feeling of contentment. Her smile remaining. This time tears did fall, and fall thick. But these were the right tears, the tears that had waited too long to be able to cry, the tears of happiness. The letter she had held in his hand dropped from his grip, though he didn't care, and it fluttered gently to the ground. Upon it, written in perfect handwritten script, read, "I have been waiting for you. Now you can stop chasing your butterflies. X." The two, wrapped in one another, began to walk up the path to the old, dilapidated-looking house in the middle of nowhere. Opening the door with a creak and a groan, the pair walked in. The old house looked in remarkable shape inside, given the condition of the outside. Beautiful, ornate old furniture decorated the inside, dusty looking, but otherwise in remarkable, if not even perfect, condition. He sat her down on the soft country chair that had a Victorian era look to it. She let him gently push her into the cushion of the chair, one hand on her shoulder, the other on her side. He need not use any force, for she gave herself all the encouragement to sit willingly, and with an awed excitement. Turning his back to her, the man, beautifully presented and turned out, his clothing tailored to perfection. Katie sat there, watching him from behind, admiring him, wondering whether this was all actually real or just another fevered dream that her desperate imagination had conjured for her yet again. But it felt too real to be a dream. She always knew when she began to dream, because everything, no matter how real it seemed or felt, began to become vague and disintegrate before her desperate sleeping vision. But this was too realistic, too incredible, ultra-realistic, with a sensation behind it that she just couldn't place, a feeling at odds with who she felt this man, this figure was, what this whole situation was, with who she was. Reaching over to the mantelpiece above the fireplace, he moved a book from the centre of a collection of books. Books that she had noticed when she first entered the house. Sensing that they seemed very out of place, given that there didn't appear to be any other books, certainly no bookshelves or any books in other cabinets that she could see around. Turning back to her to face her once again, book in hand. The man, smiling, his beauty startling and almost unbearable for her to absorb any more, yet she still found it impossible to take her eyes off him. It was as though he was addictive, and he was for sure by now as booked to him as a junkie is to heroin. Holding the book onwards and outwards, he came in close to her to show her. She could see the unique design of the cover, the intricate and complex. It seemed to be covered in some kind of leather, though what kind of leather she couldn't tell. It was dyed leather, such as some of the beautiful leather-bound books at the library that she had seen, with gold leaf lettering and gold and edged pages, but deep brown, with like some of the leather-bound books she had seen in museums. No, this was a pale-looking leather, a much finer, thinner leather, much more delicate than other leather books. Yet, at the same time, it gave off the aura of being far more sinister, more dangerous, maybe, though she could not explain to herself why she would feel this way about a book. He opened the book and skimmed through the pages, letting her see the title of each chapter in the book as he did so, until they got to a spot where in the book she wasn't sure how far through it was, but at some angles it looked like it was halfway through the book, close to the centre pages. Other angles it seemed as though it was close to the beginning or near to the back. It was becoming almost impossible to tell. But there, in the place that he had stopped the book, there was clearly the remnants of a page, or maybe pages, missing from the tome. He looked into her eyes as she too into his. He smiled and finally he spoke. Today we write a new chapter in this book of mine. Your chapter. Katie was a little stunned and found herself without the ability to respond. The sound of her voice just not there. As she attempted to reply, she felt weakness take hold as excitement, adoration, love overwhelmed her. The more she stared into his large, beautiful, dark eyes that seemed to steal away all the inhibitions and hesitancies she had ever had, yet left her feeling weak and exhausted. He placed the book down onto the small coffee table near the old fireplace. He leant down to her and gently brushing his face against her, cheek to cheek, he reached round and removed the letter that she still clung to as though it were the key to a lost treasure of ancient gold. Taking it to the coffee table, he placed it down in the place in the open book. To her astonishment, the letter fit perfectly against the torn edges. It made no sense and her mind began to spin and rush with adrenaline and confusion, the edges appearing to sparkle, to ripple. Waves of colour danced along the edges of the letter and the page until both were fully merged and as one together. "I told you," he said, turning his head back to face her once more. "Now, shall we complete this chapter together?" Madame Butterfly. His intoxicated smile drew her over to him. It was as if she just floated to him, and she found herself in his wondrous embrace once more. Before Katie could utter a word, even so much as a sound, the entire building began to unknit itself, become undone, as though the world was eating it away, bit by bit. Each piece now breaking into smaller fragments of themselves that turned into small butterflies. Each butterfly then fluttering directly into the book, disappearing in a ripple of fluidity within the page itself. Over and over this happened, again and again, until there was nothing left except the fireplace, the table, Katie, and him. The reality began to suddenly break through like an awful waking nightmare. Much like that, she felt herself unable to move, as though she was stuck in a sleep paralysis, conscious of everything of what was happening, yet unable to do a damn thing about it. The final moments arrived, and Katie watched her own body become unstitched, unmade, and fragmenting into tiny butterflies of its own, each one diving into the book, each leaving another ripple upon the pages. The reality of a trickster hit hard, harder than ever before. And as she finally broke into the last few tiny butterflies, a single solitary tear ran down her face as it too became undone. Something, however, dropped to the ground, whole and not unmade. The man looked around. His work here was done. The only things left were himself, the table, and the book. Picking the book up, he closed it with a satisfied smile, turning to return through the park. For many more desires and more dreams lay back there. He looked down to his feet. There, laying untouched, was a perfectly preserved human heart. You belong to me. Vaya reached down, picked it up, and placed it inside his breast pocket. Katie's story had become another chapter in the book of Majik, and Katie, another soul, now wandering the worlds of the Majik, transformed, unable to return to the world she had arrived from. Her shoulder blades now the foundation of an incredible pair of butterfly wings that displayed wide open, adorned with and emitted as infinite spectrum of iridescent shifting colours that twisted and beamed as though her wings were crystal prisms, bending and redirecting light at will as it hit them. They pierced the gloomier corners and crevices of the strange world that she now inhabited, with all the myriad altered anatomies of the many other souls that had found themselves there through their own desires and their own obsessions, unique to themselves and their own stories. held within that beautifully macabre book, bound in the flesh of its unwitting authors.